Hey everyone, before we get started, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so YouTube keeps sending you more spine-chilling stories like these. My name is Jasper. For 3 months every summer, I run the Fire Lookout Tower on Savage Peak, one of the loneliest, highest points in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's 80 feet up, a square glass box built on steel stilts. My nearest neighbor is a radio mast 5 miles away. I live by the rhythm of the wind, the sun, and the distant, crackling static of the two-way radio. I took the job for the quiet, but the quiet, I found out, can be loud. This was my last week on the job. The air was turning crisp, and the leaves were just starting to show that rusty tinge that signals the end of the season. I was already winding down, packing my books, and wiping the grit off the circular map table that dominates the cabin. On Tuesday night around 11 p.m., I was listening to a college football game on a portable radio when my attention snapped to the viewing deck. The night was cold and clear, illuminated by a brilliant, 3/4 moon that made the valley below look like a massive dark sheet of crumpled velvet. I noticed a light, not a natural light like a star or the moon, and not the steady beam of a hiker's headlamp. This was a single, strong spotlight, moving slowly, methodically, deep in the Devil's Cradle Hollow, an area so remote it's barely passable even during the day. I grabbed my binoculars, a powerful military set, and focused them. The light belonged to a pickup truck, an older model with massive, oversized tires. It was backed up to an abandoned, overgrown coal access road, and it was pointed away from the hollow. 3 figures were moving in the beam of the truck's light. They were working hard, dragging something large and pale from the back of the truck, moving it toward a patch of disturbed earth near a grouping of dark hemlocks. I adjusted the focus until the scene was brutally clear. The pale object was wrapped in a canvas tarp, secured with thick rope, but as they struggled to maneuver it, the tarp slipped. For a sickening second, the bright moonlight and the truck's spotlight hit the exposed shape. It was a human leg, a woman's leg, bare and bent at an unnatural angle. My breath caught in my throat. I lowered the binoculars, my hands shaking violently. I stared out into the darkness, processing the horror. A burial, a murder. I was the only person within 20 miles, and I was watching a crime in progress. I raised the binoculars again, forcing myself to watch. They quickly covered the exposed body part, shoving the bundle into a hastily dug hole. They worked with a focused, brutal efficiency, covering the body, tamping down the earth, and then throwing a thick layer of pine needles and fallen leaves over the disturbed ground. The crime was finished in under 20 minutes. The 3 men climbed back into the truck. The headlights snapped off. They spent a moment in total darkness, silent, listening. Then the truck engine turned over and they drove slowly, carefully, back down the access road and vanished into the dense shadows of the valley. I was left alone in my glass box, 80 feet above the world, watching the empty, silent hollow. I did the only thing I could do. I grabbed the radio mic, my hands slick with sweat. Control, this is Savage Peak. Do you read? I need to report a possible homicide. I repeated my location, the coordinates of the hollow, and a description of the truck and the men. My voice was tight and shaky. The voice that came back was static-laced and thin, the familiar voice of Control, an old man named Ray, 1,000 miles away. Savage Peak, I copy. Acknowledged, 1 possible incident in Sector Delta. I will relay to the county sheriff. Stay on channel, Jasper. I spent the next 2 hours staring at the dark hollow, convinced the men would return. They didn't. By 2 a.m., I forced myself to sit down, the adrenaline leaving me cold and weak. The sun came up, burning off the last wisps of valley mist. I could clearly see the patch of hemlocks where the burial had taken place. The disturbed earth was almost perfectly concealed. I knew the police response would be slow. This wasn't city crime. It would take the county sheriff hours to get up here, and they'd probably struggle to even find the access road I described. I spent the whole day glued to the radio, waiting for a crackle of news. Nothing. Just Ray, occasionally checking in with the standard, all clear, Savage Peak. Around 4 p.m., the radio finally came alive with new chatter, a different voice, deep and professional. Savage Peak, this is Sheriff Deputy Vance. We're in the area of Devil's Cradle. We can't locate the access road you described. Can you advise? I got on the radio, guiding him patiently, minute by minute, using landmarks only I could see from the tower. Turn left at the double-split pine. Follow the dried creek bed. It's the second trail to your right, Deputy. Finally, at 6 p.m., just as the sun was setting, I saw the deputy's patrol truck finally pull up to the hemlocks. But he didn't stop there. He parked 20 feet away and got out, not looking at the disturbed earth, but looking straight up at the tower. He pulled out a pair of binoculars, not high-powered like mine, but good ones, and held them steady, staring right into my glass cabin. My stomach sank. I hadn't seen the men leave a note, a sign, anything. How did he know to look at the tower first? The deputy never looked at the grave. He just stared up at me for a long, agonizing minute. Then he turned, got back into his truck, and backed out onto the main road. He didn't acknowledge me on the radio. He just drove away. The feeling of psychological paranoia hit me like a physical blow. The three men hadn't just buried a body, they had planned for a witness. They hadn't left a clue on the ground, but something about the vulnerability of the tower must have tipped them off. I looked down at the circular map table. I realized what I must have done. When I reported the incident, I gave the coordinates. The tower is the only landmark for miles that can give perfect, precise coordinates of the hollow. They must have been watching the radio traffic, put two and two together, and sent someone to silence the witness before the real investigation could start. The high-tension scene arrived with the night. I spent the evening in silent, suffocating terror. I locked the trapdoor leading to the cabin, barricading it with the few pieces of furniture I had. I was trapped in a flimsy glass cage, a giant visible target 80 feet in the air. Around 1 a.m., the radio crackled. It wasn't Ray. It wasn't the deputy. The voice was a low, gravelly whisper, barely audible over the static. It was one of the men I had seen burying the body. "Savage Peak, that's a real nice view you got up there, Jasper. But you shouldn't have looked so close. You shouldn't have told anybody what you saw." I froze. They knew my name. They had found my frequency. "How did you know to look up here?" I whispered into the dead air. The voice chuckled, a wet, horrifying sound. "We didn't. We just saw the tracks of the sheriff driving out, and we saw the big, empty eyes of the tower. Too perfect, Jasper. You're the best-known secret in this whole damn mountain range." He was right. The tower was visible for miles. He hadn't needed to be smart. He just needed to be a local who knew the mountain's only sentinel. "We're on the ridge, Jasper. We're coming up to say goodnight." I ran to the east-facing window and looked down. Nothing. Just the dark, silent forest. I looked down the steel ladder that ran from the ground to the trapdoor. In the faint moonlight, I saw a flicker of movement, a shadow detaching itself from the base of the tower. They weren't using the road. They were climbing the mountain trails in the dead of night. They were coming for the tower, not in a truck, but on foot, relying on silence and stealth. I grabbed my rifle, my hands slick on the cold metal. The tower was defenseless. The glass wouldn't stop a bullet. I had only one shot at this. I looked at the only thing I had that was more powerful than a rifle, the flare gun. I raced to the middle of the cabin, placed the flare gun on the map table, and aimed it straight down, directly at the trapdoor. My plan was desperate. If they made it to the top, I'd blast the door open and hopefully blind and burn the first man. I waited. The only sound was the wind buffeting the glass and the agonizing thump-thump of my own heart. Then I heard it, a faint, metallic scrape. It wasn't from the trapdoor. It was from the base of the tower. They weren't using the ladder. They were climbing the steel support beams on the outside, using the structural cross members as handholds. I was facing a horror crime in my own home, trapped 80 feet in the air. I moved to the nearest window overlooking the support beams. I couldn't see anything, but the scraping was getting closer, moving up the steel frame like a giant, malicious insect. I raised my rifle, pointing it out the glass. I couldn't shoot through it, but I could make noise. Just as the scraping reached the halfway point, I fired one shot into the air, yelling out, "I have you on sight! I will light this tower up!" The scraping stopped. Silence again. Total, suffocating silence. I waited 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20. The air was thick with the scent of fear and gunpowder. Finally, I heard a faint sound on the radio, but it wasn't the killer's voice. It was Ray. "Jasper? Savage Peak? You copy that gunshot, son? What's going on?" "Ray," I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. "They're here. They tried to climb the tower. They know I saw the burial." "Hold tight, son. I'm contacting the state police. They're 10 minutes out from the valley entrance. You just hold tight." I spent the rest of the night pressed against the wall, rifle in hand, watching the support beams in the moonlight. I never saw them again. The men, realizing they were out of time and out of silence, had slipped back into the dark woods. At dawn, a state police helicopter landed gently near the base of the tower. They confirmed the disturbed earth, and they found the shoe prints of 3 men near the base of the steel structure. The woman's body was recovered. The men were tracked down and caught within 48 hours. I was safe, but the isolation had broken something in me. I finished my final paperwork and descended the tower for the last time. As I drove out of the Blue Ridge Mountains, I never looked back. I realized that the true horror wasn't seeing the crime. It was the chilling, paralyzing knowledge that, for one night, the only person who knew my secrets was the very man who wanted me dead. The tower had saved me, but it had also turned me into an indelible target. The woods had always been my escape, not for hiking or nature spotting, but for quiet. The kind of quiet you can only get deep in the Appalachian high country, where the cell signal dies and the only traffic is deer and maybe a black bear. I wasn't lost. I was hiding. Hiding from the world, hiding from my own debt, and hiding up here in a rickety deer blind I'd built 3 years ago, a good 5 miles off the nearest gravel road. It was early October, cold enough to see your breath, but sunny enough that the changing leaves were a blinding, golden curse. I'd been checking my traps, running a few snares to supplement the dry goods I'd packed in. I'd walked an extra mile that morning, following a faint game trail that eventually led to a clearing I'd never seen before. It was a strange patch of land, circular, oddly flat, and bordered by a thicket of pines that looked almost planted. Right in the middle was a fire pit, large, ringed by river stones and cold. As I approached, something flashed under the pine needles near the edge of the clearing. I knelt down and brushed the dirt away. It was an industrial-grade zip tie, the kind used for bundling thick cables. Odd to find that miles from power lines, but whatever. I tossed it aside, feeling a familiar, prickling sense of unease. This place felt wrong. It was too quiet, even for the mountains. No bird song. I turned to leave, but then I heard it. Not a gunshot, not a branch snapping. It was the sound of a shovel dragging. Slow, rhythmic, and coming from the thickest part of the woods, maybe 50 yards beyond the clearing. Curiosity, that ancient, stupid human flaw, grabbed me. I dropped to a crouch and crept to the edge of the pines, using the dense, dark undergrowth as cover. I pushed aside a few low-hanging spruce branches and froze. My blood turned instantly to ice water, not just from the cold, but from what I saw. There were 2 of them, big men dressed in simple, dark work clothes, their faces shadowed by dirty ball caps. They were digging a hole, a deep one, and they weren't digging it to bury trash. Between the men, lying still on the damp earth, was a third person, a woman. She was wrapped tightly in what looked like heavy-duty plastic sheeting, like the stuff used to cover construction materials. She wasn't moving. The plastic was bound with duct tape, and I could see the outline of a body, limp and completely contained. My mind didn't process it as murder right away. It processed it as, I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be seeing this. I took one slow, deliberate step back, trying not to disturb a single needle on the forest floor. But the bigger of the 2 men stopped digging. He rested his hands on the shovel handle, tilted his head, and looked directly toward my position. The distance was too great, the cover too thick for him to have seen me. I knew that, but he was looking. "Did you hear that?" The big man, the one with a heavy, flat voice, asked the other. "Hear what, Cal?" The second man grunted, still working the shovel. "The wind?" "No. Sounded like a snap." "Over there," Cal said, pointing the tip of his shovel right at my hiding spot. I realized with a sickening lurch what he'd heard. It wasn't my step. When I dropped to a crouch a minute before, I'd unconsciously rested the end of my old, worn hunting rifle, unloaded, thank God, on a brittle, dead piece of hemlock branch. The bark had made a faint, high-pitched creak. Nothing you'd hear over city noise, but out here, it might as well have been a gunshot. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced they could hear the frantic rhythm from 50 yards away. The second man, finally looking up, shrugged. Probably just a squirrel, Cal. Get back to work. We got till midnight, and this thing ain't shallow enough. Cal muttered something I couldn't make out, but he went back to digging. That was my cue. I backed away, not standing up, but crawling backward on my belly, careful to place my hands and knees only on soft moss or decaying leaf matter. I went maybe 10 feet like that until I was certain I was out of their immediate sightline. Then I stood up, hunched over, and began to move. Fast. Not running, but moving with a speed that was almost frantic, pushing through the brush, ignoring the branches that snagged my old flannel shirt. I didn't stop until I reached my blind about 2 miles away, near a rocky stream. I slumped against the rough-hewn wooden walls of the shack, my lungs burning, sucking in the cool mountain air. The initial shock was fading, replaced by a cold, dreadful certainty. They knew these woods, too. They'd picked this spot for a reason. And now they had to be wondering if that creek was really a squirrel. If it was a person, they'd have to find that person. How far would they go to make sure they weren't seen? I needed to move. Not tomorrow, not after dark. Now. I spent the next hour working with brutal efficiency, stuffing my few supplies, a bag of dried beans, a small cook pot, my heavy wool blanket, and a hatchet, into my old canvas pack. The rifle felt heavy and useless. I didn't have much ammunition, and those men had shovels, which meant they were serious. I decided my best chance was to get to the higher peaks, where the terrain was too rough and steep for easy travel, and where there was no water access, making it unattractive to anyone looking to set up camp or dig a grave. I started moving east, uphill, just as the sun began to dip behind the western ridges. That's when the tension truly started to build. The shadows stretched out, long and distorted, turning every tree stump into a lurking figure. I hadn't gone a mile when I heard a distant sound that made my stomach clench, the sound of a vehicle engine. A big one. It was laboring, climbing the dirt path, the same path I'd taken weeks ago. They weren't just digging, they were getting reinforcements. Or maybe they were just packing up their tools. Either way, it meant someone else was now on the mountain, miles from civilization. Were they coming for me, or were they just leaving? I veered hard off the game trail, pushing straight into the dense rhododendron thickets. I didn't care about noise now. I needed cover. The thick, tough leaves clawed at my face and clothes, but they hid me. The engine noise got closer, then stopped. Not where I'd seen them, but much closer to where my abandoned blind was. Good. They wouldn't find me there, but they might find tracks. Then a new sound cut through the forest. A dog barking. A deep, aggressive bark, the kind of dog used to hunting, or worse. I froze, sinking down to my knees in the cold mud. The dog wasn't barking randomly. It was an excited bark, followed by a sharp, guttural yell. "He found something, Cal! The hound's got a scent!" My heart seemed to stop completely. They weren't just assuming it was a squirrel. They knew. They'd brought a tracker. The sun was gone now. The Appalachian night fell fast, thick, and unforgiving. It was a blackness that swallowed everything, leaving only silhouettes and the sound of your own ragged breathing. This was the high-tension scene I dreaded. I scrambled up the steep incline, praying the cold, wet rocks wouldn't take my footing. The dog's bark was closer now, not a mile away, but maybe a quarter mile, and coming fast. I reached a small, exposed rock face and squeezed into a narrow crevice, pulling my pack in behind me. I wedged my body deep, using the cold stone to mask my body heat, trying to control the ragged gasps that were surely giving me away. I could hear them now, not just the dog, but the heavy footfalls of the men crunching through the leaf litter just below the ridge. "Hold up, Boone. Check that out. Looks like a scrape mark on that moss," Cal hissed, his voice alarmingly close, maybe 20 feet away. My stomach twisted. I remembered slipping briefly on a slick patch of rock 20 yards back. Had I been sloppy? Did I just sign my own death warrant? The dog, a massive hound, judging by its snorts and labored breathing, whined right at the base of my crevice. Its nose was inches from my boots. I could hear its heavy sniffs, trying to lock onto the panic scent I was surely leaking. I did the only thing I could think of. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the single remaining piece of dried jerky I had, and threw it with a gentle flick of my wrist, not down, but off to the side, into a dense patch of mountain laurel. The dog, momentarily distracted by the sudden meaty scent, let out a confused whine, then began rooting around in the laurel. It was a distraction, not a solution. "What is it, dog? Don't you lose him?" Cal yelled. "Smells like bear scat to me, Cal. Mixed with something else, I dunno," the other man, Boone, muttered, clearly losing patience. "No, that bastard's up here. I know he is. We saw the tracks near the blind. If he saw what we did, he can't leave this mountain alive," Cal insisted, his voice now filled with a low, dangerous menace that sent shivers down my spine. I stayed silent, frozen in the crevice, the cold seeping through my wool and into my bones. I knew they wouldn't stop. They were killers, and I was their loose end. How long could I stay hidden in this freezing hole? And what was my move when they eventually gave up and left? I waited there, listening to them rustle around, cursing, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, their voices began to fade, moving back down the ridge. They didn't find me, but they knew I was here. They knew I was on the run. I waited another hour in the absolute, crushing darkness, my hands numb, my teeth starting to chatter uncontrollably. When I finally eased out of the crevice, the moon had risen, casting a faint, spectral light over the high peak ridge. I looked down at the valley where they had been. Two tiny flickering lights, flashlights, were moving slowly, methodically, back toward the clearing. They were heading back to finish the job. But I couldn't afford to run aimlessly anymore. I had seen them. I had smelled their fear and their resolve. I knew I couldn't go to the authorities. They wouldn't find the body, and these men would make me disappear. I had to become the danger. I strapped my hatchet to my belt, tightened my pack straps, and began moving, not east, but downhill and south. I needed to get around them, get off this mountain, and find a place where I could breathe and think. The horrifying truth settled on me. My escape had become a desperate game of hide and seek, and the consequences of being found were already buried in a shallow grave. The night was long, and the climb down was treacherous, but every snap of a twig I made was a new surge of adrenaline. I wasn't just surviving the mountain anymore. I was surviving the Hollow Man's clearing. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the only way off this mountain was to get past them, or to somehow ensure they never came looking for anyone again. My grandma always warned me about the deep woods, especially the places where the old logging roads went dead and the trees grew too close together. She called them places where the mountain forgets itself. She was full of old Appalachian folklore, and I always laughed it off, but I was about to stop laughing. My cousin Finn and I weren't looking for ghosts. We were looking for a lost moonshine still, a relic of my grandpa's younger, wilder days. We figured if we found the spot, we might find some old bottles, maybe even a buried jar of pure history. We were deep into the Cherokee National Forest, following a barely visible path that led to a hollow known only as the Gap. It was a tough hike, all vertical climbs and slippery slate. We started at first light, and by the time the shadows started getting long, we were exhausted and lost. Not completely, but definitely off our planned route. That's when we found the boundary. It wasn't a fence. It was a line of stones, carefully placed, running straight through the underbrush. They were river stones, but they were polished smooth, almost unnaturally so, and set upright like ancient, mossy teeth. It felt like walking from one room into a completely different house. On one side, the normal sounds of the forest. On the other, absolute, dead silence. "This isn't on the map, Eli," Finn whispered, pulling his flannel tight around his arms. "It's old," I muttered, running my hand over one of the cool stones. "Might be an old property line, something that predates the national forest boundary." We crossed it anyway. Stupidity, curiosity, whatever you call it, it made us keep walking. A few hundred yards past the stone line, the trees opened up into a clearing. It wasn't a natural clearing, it was a settlement. Not abandoned in the way an old cabin is abandoned, but abandoned in the way you leave a house when the dinner plates are still on the table. There were maybe 7 or 8 small cabins, rough-hewn log structures, but they were almost completely swallowed by the kudzu and the forest. What was unnerving was the central feature. A massive blackened tree stump that must have been 10 feet across, sitting right in the middle of the clearing. It looked like it had been struck by lightning repeatedly, carved into some kind of rudimentary altar. "Look at this," Finn breathed, pointing to the nearest cabin door. It wasn't boarded up. It was wired shut with heavy-gauge barbed wire, twisted and looped in a frantic, dense pattern. We checked every cabin. Every single one was sealed from the outside with heavy wire, rusted chains, or thick wooden beams hammered across the door frames. And there were no windows, just rough holes cut into the logs, and those, too, were covered in thick, black canvas. "What kind of place is this?" I asked, my voice dry. "It's like they locked themselves in, or someone else locked them in." We decided to investigate the stump. As we got closer, I noticed the markings. The stump wasn't naturally blackened, it was scorched, and covering the sides, carved crudely into the charred wood, were symbols, simple lines, triangles, and spirals, repeated over and over again. They didn't look like native carvings or logging marks. They looked like warnings. While Finn was running his hand over one of the markings, I noticed something glinting at the base of the stump. I reached down and picked it up. It was a single silver locket on a rusted chain. It was warm to the touch. As I flipped it open, the sun dipped behind the western ridge and the temperature dropped like a stone. Inside the locket was a tiny, faded picture of a young girl, maybe 7 or 8, smiling brightly. And that's when the sound started. It wasn't loud. It was soft, wavering, and deeply unnerving. It sounded like singing, but not human singing. It was too thin, too high-pitched, almost like a piece of wire vibrating in the wind, and it seemed to be coming from the inside of the stump. "Did you hear that?" Finn whispered, his eyes wide. He looked truly terrified. "It sounds like a high C note, held forever." I tried to rationalize, my voice cracking. The singing faded, replaced by another sound, a dragging, scraping noise, coming from one of the cabins furthest from us, the one that was wrapped in chains. The high-tension scene was upon us. We backed away slowly, not wanting to turn our backs on the cabins, not wanting to make a sound that wasn't covered by the rustle of the evening wind. The air here was heavy, thick with the smell of old ash and ozone. As we reached the perimeter of the clearing, the dragging stopped. A new sound began. It was a scratching, a frantic, desperate sound, like fingernails or small tools clawing at wood from the inside of the sealed cabin. Then, a voice, barely a rasp, came from behind the thick log walls. Not singing. A prayer. "Oh, sweet mother of the mountain, let us sleep, let us sleep!" The voice was old, brittle, and full of raw, pleading agony. We moved faster now, shoving our way through the brush, scrambling for the line of standing stones. We didn't look back, we just ran until we crossed that strange, quiet boundary. As soon as we stepped back onto the normal side of the woods, the ambient noise of the forest flooded back. Crickets, hoot owls, the gentle drip-drip of condensation. But the sense of dread didn't leave us. We had to get off the mountain and fast. It was full dark now, and we had no light but the weak, flickering glow of our phone screens. We had only gone about a mile when we heard it again, but this time it wasn't the thin, high singing. It was a low, deep humming, like a heavy machine vibrating through the earth, and it was coming from behind us. "They know we were there, Eli," Finn gasped, tripping over a root. Something followed us. "Keep moving. We need to hit the creek. If we can get to the water, maybe we lose the scent," I yelled, not knowing if the threat was human, animal, or something else entirely. We ran blindly for another 15 minutes, tearing down the mountain slope, until we burst out onto the rocky bank of the creek. We plunged right into the frigid water, splashing across it, not caring about the noise, just hoping the flowing water would break whatever trail we left. We scrambled up the opposite bank, dripping and shivering, and ducked behind a stand of huge, dark hemlocks. We stood there, panting, listening to the night. The humming stopped. Total silence again. The mountain seemed to be holding its breath. Had we lost it? What was it we were even running from? Then, from the ridge we had just descended, something moved. Not a man, not an animal. It was a light, a small, intensely bright pinprick of light, moving slowly, methodically back and forth through the trees, about 50 feet above the creek. It wasn't a flashlight beam. It was too steady, too focused. It was like a single, disembodied eye sweeping the ground. It stopped. And then slowly the light began to descend the bank toward the creek. "Get down!" I hissed, pulling Finn behind a thick layer of dead brush. The light stopped right on the edge of the water, maybe 30 feet from where we were hiding. It stayed perfectly still for almost a minute. We heard a faint clicking noise, and then the light was gone. "It left? Is it gone?" Finn whispered, his voice shaky. "No," I choked out, staring at the spot where the light had been. "Listen." The humming was back, but now it was closer, directly across the creek. And it wasn't just humming. It was accompanied by a slow, heavy sound, the sound of something dragging itself across the sharp river stones. It was moving into the water. Splash, drag, splash, drag. Whatever it was large, and it was slow, and it was crossing the creek right where we had just been. Suddenly a voice, incredibly close and low, broke the silence. It wasn't the old prayer, and it wasn't the high singing. It was a man's voice, deep and gravelly, sounding like it was speaking from the bottom of a well. "The locket. She needs the locket back." I tightened my grip on the silver object in my pocket. The warmth of the metal seemed to intensify. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't outrun whatever this was, and it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. I took the locket out, opened my hand, and with all the force I could muster, I threw it far into the deepest, darkest part of the creek. Splash. The dragging noise stopped immediately. The deep voice was replaced by a high, agonizing shriek that ripped through the night air, the sound echoing off the ridges like breaking glass. The shriek was followed by a frenzy of violent thrashing in the water, sounds of something heavy struggling against the current. We ran. We ran until our lungs burned, until the shriek was a distant memory, until we finally hit the familiar ground of the main logging road. We didn't stop running until we saw the headlights of the highway, miles away. We never went back to the gap. We never told anyone what we saw. But sometimes when I'm alone and the wind is just right, I can still hear the faint, high, wire-like sound of the singing stump, a sound that reminds me that there are places in the Appalachian Mountains that the mountain wants to keep secret. The first thing I remember about that morning was the fog. Not the thin, wispy stuff you get in the morning after a cold rain, but a thick, milky, bone-chilling shroud that had rolled in overnight from the valleys and settled right over the Appalachian peaks. It was so dense you could barely see your own boots. I was hunting with Dale, my best friend since grade school. We'd been coming up to his family's remote hunting land near Mount Rogers every November for 15 years. It was supposed to be our annual escape, our quiet time away from wives and jobs. This time, it felt like we were walking on the bottom of a cold, gray ocean. "I don't like this, man," Dale muttered, his voice sounding muffled and too close through the moisture-laden air. I could hear his heavy breathing, but I couldn't see his face, even though he was walking 10 feet ahead of me. "Can't see squat. Maybe we turn back, grab coffee." "And miss the buck of the season?" I called back, trying to sound jovial, though my gut was twisting. The fog made the air feel heavy, suffocating. The deer are spooked, hiding close. It's perfect cover. We'd hiked about 2 miles off the main trail, deep into a section of old-growth pines where the ground was treacherous with slick shale and fallen logs. That's when we heard the snap. A crisp, definite crack of a branch breaking, maybe 50 yards to our left. We both froze. "Big one," Dale whispered. "And close. Didn't hear us coming." He slowly raised his rifle, holding his breath. I did the same, trying to pierce the white veil, squinting until my eyes watered. Every shadow looked like a shoulder, every pine trunk like a haunch. My heart hammered, but it wasn't just the excitement of the hunt. It was a cold, sharp dread that the fog was playing tricks on me. Then, through the haze, I saw it. A massive, dark shape moving, low to the ground. It was definitely an animal, and it looked enormous. Dale saw it too. He didn't hesitate. The gunshot was deafening, amplified by the dense air, shattering the silence and ringing in my ears. I saw the shadow lurch, a sharp cry, and then nothing. "Got him!" Dale yelled, his voice relieved, triumphant. He started moving immediately, plunging into the thicket where the sound had come from. I lowered my rifle, feeling the adrenaline rush fade, replaced by a dull anxiety. I couldn't shake the sound of that cry. It hadn't been a deer's bleat. It sounded strangely human. I followed Dale, pushing through the pine needles. The fog, if possible, seemed to thicken even more, pressing down on us like a wet blanket. "Dale, wait up!" I called. I found him a minute later. He was standing stock still, staring down. The moment I stepped into the small break in the trees, I saw what he had shot. It wasn't a deer. It was a man. A local hunter, maybe in his late 50s, dressed in dark brown hunting clothes with no blaze orange. He was lying on his side, an old .22 rifle lying uselessly beside him. He wasn't moving. A dark, rapidly blooming stain had soaked into the shoulder of his jacket. Dale turned to me, his face ash gray, eyes wide and panicked. The rifle slipped from his grasp and landed with a dull thud in the wet soil. "Oh God. Oh no, no, no," he stammered, his voice thin. He was crawling. I swear I thought it was a bear or a big hog rooting around. He wasn't wearing any color, Eli. Any color. I dropped to my knees, feeling for a pulse in the man's neck. Nothing. His skin was already cooling. He'd been shot clean through the chest. Dead instantly. I stood up, wiping the cold, sticky moisture from my hands. I looked at Dale. He was pale, shaking, utterly broken. "Dale, we need to call the sheriff. Right now, it was an accident. We tell them exactly what happened. The fog, no color, honest mistake." Dale didn't seem to hear me. He looked around wildly at the towering silent pines, then back at the body, and finally his gaze settled on me. "No, no, Eli, you don't understand," he said, his voice dropping to a desperate, manic whisper. "My whole life is riding on this. The business, the divorce. I'm already on probation for the DUI. If they charge me with manslaughter, even negligent, I'm done. Prison. Everything gone." He took a step toward me, desperation pouring off him like sweat. "You're the only one who saw it. We were hunting. We were separated in the fog. He shot the gun. He didn't hit anything. He heard another shot, panicked and ran. He came back later and found the body. We need to go back now, clean up and call it in later. Say we just found him." My mind reeled. He was asking me to lie to the police, to cover up a death, to risk my own freedom for his. "I can't do that, Dale. That's obstruction. That's a felony. You think they'll believe you?" He challenged, his voice suddenly hard. "It's your word against mine, and I'll tell them you didn't see a thing. You were too far back. Or better yet," he took a ragged breath, the paranoia clearly setting in, "I'll tell them you were the one ahead of me, that you shot him and you're trying to pin it on me." The accusation hung in the heavy, cold air. The fog, the silence, the remote location, it all conspired to make his threat terrifyingly real. No one knew exactly where we were. No one was going to hear anything until the fog lifted. I looked at the body, then at the thick fog, and then at Dale. He wasn't my friend right now. He was a desperate animal backed into a corner, and I was the only witness. How far would he go to save his own life? Did I truly know the man standing 10 feet from me? The decision was made for me when I heard the low, unmistakable drone of a small plane above the fog layer. Someone was flying low, maybe checking power lines, maybe someone associated with the local land. If they saw anything below the fog line, we were finished. Okay, Dale, stop," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "We have to get the body out of here. If someone saw the smoke or heard the shot, they'll check this clearing first." Dale nodded, his eyes lighting up with a dangerous mix of relief and renewed panic. "The ravine, 300 yards east. Nobody ever goes down there." We worked with a terrifying, silent efficiency. We wrapped the dead man in a heavy tarp Dale always carried for dragging out game. It was a miserable, back-breaking haul, pulling the weight over the slippery, uneven ground. We left the dead man's rifle where it lay. We wiped down the rifle that was used. We finally reached the edge of a deep, rocky ravine, choked with thorn bushes and thick scrub oak. We pushed the body over the edge. It tumbled down the sheer slope with a heavy, sickening sound of tearing fabric and cracking branches. It was hidden completely. We stood there panting, the adrenaline spiking again. The fog still hadn't lifted. It was full afternoon, but it felt like twilight. "Now what?" I asked, my voice flat. "We go back to the cabin. We pack up. We go home. We tell everyone we left at lunch because of the fog," Dale instructed, his mind racing. He was recovering his composure, which was more frightening than his panic. "You swear on everything, Eli. You weren't here. You never saw him." I didn't answer right away. I was looking at his face, at the cold, calculating look in his eyes that had replaced the fear. "I swear I'll keep quiet, Dale. But this changes everything." We started walking back, but Dale began to lead us not toward the main trail, but deeper into the woods toward the ridgeline. "Where are we going?" I asked, my hand instinctively dropping to the rifle strap on my shoulder. "We're taking the long way around," he explained too quickly. "We can't risk crossing the clearing again. They might already be up here." He was lying. The clearing was the quickest way back. He was leading us into the thickest part of the mountain. My paranoia, the psychological tension, reached its peak. Was he trying to lose me? Or was he trying to lose me permanently? The light began to fail. The deep Appalachian night, combined with the unyielding fog, created a blackness so profound it felt like I'd gone blind. We were walking single file on a narrow goat track carved into a cliff face. I was walking behind Dale. The air was cold, and I could hear nothing but the drip of the fog off the pine needles and the muffled sound of Dale's steps just ahead. Suddenly, Dale stopped. Not a slow stop, a sharp, instantaneous halt. "Wait," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I hear something." I stopped too. Nothing. Just the dripping. "What is it?" I whispered back. "Someone whistling," he said, his voice tight with fear. "Down in the hollow, a low, slow tune. It's too close to be a hunter, too close to be coincidence." We stood there, frozen, for a terrifying 5 minutes. Dale's breathing was ragged again. The fog was his sanctuary, but now it was his trap. Then I heard it too. A faint, repetitive whistle. Not a tune, but a signal. "They're looking for him," I breathed. The man we buried. Someone knows he's up here." Dale spun around, his face a ghostly pale smear in the darkness. He grabbed my arm, his grip crushing. "We have to split up. They can't catch both of us. You go down the slope, I'll take the ridge. If they find one of us, they don't find the other," he hissed. He was right. But the look in his eyes told me a different story. He wanted me to go into the thickest, most dangerous part of the woods alone, leaving him to escape unencumbered. He wanted to split up so that if they found him, I couldn't testify. And if they found me, he'd be safe. I ripped my arm out of his grasp. "No, I'm not leaving the path. We stick together until we hit the road." He didn't argue. He just stared at me, his rifle now raised slightly, not aimed, but ready. His best friend had become his biggest threat. I made my decision. I reached into my pack and pulled out the old hunting flare I carried. Before he could react, I activated it and jammed it into the earth, facing downhill, away from our path. The flare ignited with a searing white psst, illuminating the ridge with blinding intensity. It was a beacon. It was a confession. "We go now, Dale. They'll come running to the light," I yelled, not caring about the noise. Dale stared at the flare, his escape route instantly compromised. His expression shifted from betrayal to absolute terror. He knew I had just eliminated his option to disappear quietly. "You son of a—" he started. "Move!" I roared, shoving him forward along the path. We ran, not as friends, but as terrified co-conspirators, shackled by a terrible secret and the silent, blinding fog. The high-tension scene ended not when the whistling stopped, but when we turned our backs on the incriminating light of the flare, knowing we were now bound to the same dark fate. We didn't stop until we hit the gravel road, still enveloped in the fog, the sounds of the mountain now utterly silent behind us. We got in the truck and drove, the terrifying question hanging between us. When the fog finally lifts, will we still be running from the hunters or from each other? But as we cleared the mountainside and the fog started to thin, I knew one thing. Dale would never trust me again, and I would spend the rest of my life watching my back. The betrayal was complete, but our shared secret was heavier than any prison sentence. We drove into the false dawn, two friends now just two scared men, irrevocably bound by a shared horror in the silence of the Appalachian morning. My name is Clara, and I chase silence. Not the absence of sound, but the deep, layered hush you only find in places where humanity is an echo. That's why I was 25 miles deep into the George Washington National Forest, high up in the most neglected corner of the Appalachian peaks, seeking shots of the elusive northern flying squirrel and the even rarer Appalachian cottontail. I'd hiked for 2 days to reach my chosen spot, a dense, elevated thicket overlooking a small, isolated valley. It was perfect. The only structure for miles was a tiny, dilapidated log cabin nestled by a slow-moving stream below. I'd assumed it was abandoned. It was far too remote to be otherwise. I spent the first 2 days building my blind, a small camouflage structure of branches and netting, and setting up my long lens cameras. The weather was crisp and clear, the autumn colors vibrant. I was in my element. On the third morning, I was reviewing the previous night's thermal footage when I saw something I couldn't explain. A faint wisp of smoke curling from the cabin's stone chimney. Someone was living there. I felt a surge of professional disappointment. My perfect silence was compromised, quickly followed by a prickle of suspense. Who lives this far out? I repositioned one of my longest lenses. The cabin was about 400 yards away, slightly obscured by a line of scrub pines, but with the telephoto, I could see details. The front porch was cluttered, and a battered older pickup truck, caked in dried mud, was parked behind a woodpile. Later that day, I got my first clear look at the occupant. He was a man, tall and thin, moving with a stiff, almost jerky gait. He wore dark, simple clothing, jeans, a thermal shirt, and a worn baseball cap, and he spent hours splitting wood, working with a relentless mechanical rhythm that felt unsettlingly obsessive. He never looked around. He never seemed to relax. For the first few days, I rationalized his presence. Hermit, survivalist, just another man trying to disappear into the woods. But the routine started to feel wrong. Every day the same sequence. Chop wood, tend the small, meager garden, and then as the sun began to dip, he would do the strange thing. He would carry a single, large metal bucket down to the edge of the stream. He'd stand there for a moment, looking around, even though there was nothing to see. Then he would pour the contents of the bucket into the stream. I couldn't see the liquid, but it was thick and slow, and it left a strange metallic sheen on the surface of the water for a few minutes before the current took it away. It wasn't gray water. It wasn't garbage. It looked like blood. I tried to tell myself it was butchering waste, deer remnants, something rational, but the stream was running low, and the next day, a deep, oily stain began to appear on the rocks near the cabin, a dark brown residue that didn't wash away. My curiosity quickly curdled into dangerous obsession. I couldn't stop watching him. My wildlife photography became secondary. I was now focused on the observer and the man in the cabin. On day 6, he came out carrying a shovel. He walked behind the cabin to a patch of ground bordered by old, dying rhododendrons. He started digging a hole. He dug for almost 2 hours, a hole that was too deep for a fence post and too small for a septic field. It was the size of a grave. When he was done, he left the shovel sticking upright in the mound of fresh earth and went back inside the cabin. I watched that hole all night. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, anxious drumbeat in the vast, still forest. What was he planning to put in there? The next day, nothing happened. He filled the bucket from the stream, watered his small garden, and went back to chopping wood. The open hole remained, a black, waiting mouth in the landscape. My fear was palpable now. I knew I should pack up and hike out, but the suspense, the need to know what he was doing, had me paralyzed. On day 8, the weather turned. A sudden, cold front brought fierce winds and a driving, heavy rain that lasted through the afternoon. I was stuck in my blind, wrapped in my poncho, the forest a blurred gray wash. Around 8 p.m., the rain finally stopped, leaving a heavy mist that clung to the stream bed. The man's cabin was completely dark. I had been running a time-lapse camera focused on the open grave. I checked the screen. The open hole was still open. Then at 9:30 p.m., the cabin door creaked open. The high-tension scene began. The man stepped out. He was carrying no light. He was just a tall, dark silhouette against the fainter darkness of the misty clearing. He didn't go toward the grave. He went to the old pickup truck. He opened the passenger door and he reached inside. I pressed my eye against the camera viewfinder, adjusting the focus with a trembling hand, using the faint ambient light from the mist. He pulled something out, something long and limp, wrapped tightly in a canvas tarp. He carried it with a strained awkwardness, the weight pulling his thin frame off balance. My blood ran cold. It was the size and shape of a human body. He didn't take the body directly to the grave. Instead, he carried it to a small, rickety shed behind the cabin, a structure I hadn't paid much attention to. He shoved the body into the shed, quickly locked the padlock on the door, and then walked back to the truck. He got into the driver's seat. The engine coughed to life, rattling violently in the night silence. He drove the truck slowly, not toward the road, but past the cabin, directly toward the open grave. He stopped at the edge of the hole, got out, and then did the strangest thing I'd seen yet. He didn't unload anything. Instead, he took the shovel from the dirt mound and started rapidly filling the hole back in. He was burying an empty grave. Why? Was he paranoid? Was it a decoy? Or was he closing off a chapter of some terrible plan? I was breathing shallow, desperate gasps of cold air. I should have been terrified enough to run, but the adrenaline had numbed me. I was a witness now, and the truth felt both clearer and infinitely more confusing. He finished filling the hole in under 10 minutes, tamping down the soil with the back of the shovel. Then he got back in the truck and drove it right over the fresh earth, flattening the mound completely. He drove the truck a final time, parking it precisely where it had been before, and then walked back toward the dark shed. He looked at the shed for a long moment, then slowly turned, his head tilted back, and stared straight up the hill, directly at my hidden position. He couldn't have seen me. I was high up, camouflaged, and it was pitch black, but the cold certainty in his posture, the absolute focus of his gaze, felt like a direct accusation. I pressed myself against the damp wooden frame of my blind, my rifle lying uselessly beside me. He stood there for 2 solid minutes. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that was heavy with menace, he reached down to his waist and pulled out a large hunting knife. He didn't raise it. He just held it in the moonlight, turning the blade slowly so it caught the faint light. Then he walked to the porch, entered the cabin, and shut the door with a chilling finality. The only sound left was the distant murmur of the stream. I didn't move for an hour. My entire body was shaking, but my mind was clicking. He hadn't buried the body. He'd hidden it in the shed. He'd buried the grave to confuse anyone watching, and he knew someone was watching. The knife was a message. I knew I had to leave. My job was over, replaced by a desperate need for survival. But I couldn't just hike out. The cabin man might already be watching the main trail. I packed up my blind in complete silence, moving with surgical precision. But as I slung my heavy pack over my shoulder, I realized I couldn't leave the shed behind. That canvas bundle was the key. Did I dare risk everything to photograph the evidence? I decided against it. I had the when and the where, and the knowledge that the body was secured in the shed and the time of the burial. But as I began to creep away, I heard it. A faint, low wail coming from the direction of the shed. Not a human cry of pain, but a deep, mournful sound, like a tethered animal. The sound was desperate, and it was a sound of life, not death. It changed the narrative again. I stopped, staring down at the dark, silent clearing. Was it a hostage? A captive? My dangerous obsession collided violently with my moral imperative. I was already miles away from help, and the man in the cabin was armed and clearly unstable. I fought the urge to turn back. I kept walking, moving toward the farthest, roughest part of the ridgeline. My survival depended on leaving. I was already too deep into the darkness. As I began my torturous hike through the tangle of the night forest, the last thought that clawed at my mind was the man's gaze. I knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in my heart, that he hadn't just been looking at the hill. He'd been looking at me, and now he knew I was gone. The hunter had become the prey. The long trek out of the Appalachian peaks had just become a race against a dangerous, deeply obsessed killer. I've lived alone in this hollow for 20 years. Off-grid, no cell service, no nearest neighbor closer than 5 miles by jeep trail. After 30 years as a forest ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains, dealing with fire, flood, and far too many fool tourists, I bought this land and retired from humanity. My life was simple. My garden, my dog, an old shepherd mix named Tracker, and the blessed, impenetrable quiet of the mountains. I thought I'd left the danger behind, but the mountains always hold their secrets close, and sometimes those secrets walk right up to your front porch. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon. Tracker was barking, not his usual lazy, territorial bark, but a low, throat-rattling snarl. I grabbed my rifle from the rack and stepped out onto the porch. Standing about 50 yards away near the edge of my clearing was a man. He was old, maybe 70, with thin white hair pulled back in a tidy ponytail. He wore clean, expensive-looking hiking gear and carried a lightweight day pack. He looked like a wealthy tourist who had gotten terribly lost. He held up his hands, palm out, a gentle, practiced gesture. "Mighty fine shepherd, mister. Don't worry, I won't come any closer. Just looking for the old logging road that cuts across this ridge. Think I've gotten turned around." I kept my rifle raised. Tourists don't hike this deep, not with clothes that clean. "You're about 10 miles from a marked trail," I said, my voice rough from disuse. "The road you're looking for is dried up and impassable. Turn around and follow the creek back down." He smiled. It was a slow, easy smile that didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were the color of glacial ice, and they were studying me. Not my face, but my setup. The generators, the water pump, the heavy-duty locks on my shed. "Appreciate the directions," he said, nodding. "I'll get on my way then." He turned and disappeared into the rhododendron thicket. Tracker still whined, watching the spot where the man had vanished. I watched for another 5 minutes, then slowly lowered the rifle. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His eyes. They were too sharp for a lost hiker. I went inside and made coffee, but my mind was spinning. I sat down at my worn wooden table and pulled out the old photo album I rarely touched. It wasn't full of family pictures. It was full of old FBI and Ranger Service case files, a collection of cold cases I couldn't let go of. I flipped past forest fires, past missing person reports, until I found the section I was looking for, the Stone Mountain Crew. They were notorious. A group of 3 bank robbers who hit 5 banks across 3 states in the 90s, always using surgical precision and 0 casualties. They got away with millions and disappeared completely into the Appalachian backwoods. No trace, no bodies, no money ever found. The theory was they'd melted into the deep country, using the isolation of the mountains they grew up in to their advantage. I stopped at the picture of the leader, a man named Silas the Slick Kane. The photo was 25 years old, black and white, but the face was instantly recognizable. The sharp cheekbones, the thin lips, the way the light caught those unnervingly pale eyes. I stared at the picture, then back at the door. Silas Kane would be pushing 70 now. But the man who just walked onto my land, the expensive hiker with the glacial eyes, was him. The hair was white and the lines were deeper, but it was him, the Slick. The man who never aged, because he spent a quarter-century living on stolen time. My peaceful isolation was a lie. I was living next door to a fugitive with millions buried somewhere, and he'd just seen the man who might recognize him. My retirement was officially over. The thought of turning him in was immediately replaced by a chilling realization. He was smart. If he was hiding out near my land, he was deep. If I left to call the authorities, he would be gone the second I drove out of the valley, and I wouldn't be able to prove a thing. I had to know what he was doing here. I decided to watch him. I waited until midnight. It was a cold, clear night, the moon hidden by a thick canopy of old oaks. I packed a small bag, my night vision monocular, a thermos of cold water, and a backup flare gun, just in case. Tracker whined, but I left him locked safely inside the cabin. I found his camp about 3 miles from my cabin, precisely where the impassable logging road was supposed to be. He hadn't just gotten lost. He had a base camp. It was a small, well-maintained tent set up in a hollow, shielded by heavy pine boughs. No fire, no lights. I climbed a small rise overlooking the camp and settled in behind a thicket of scrub pine. I pulled out the monocular and scanned the area. He wasn't in the tent. I froze. My pulse started a frantic rhythm in my ears. Did he know I was following him? Was this a trap? I kept scanning. Nothing moved. The only sounds were the crickets and the faint, cold wind in the pines. Then, my eye caught a faint shimmer near the base of an enormous, half-dead chestnut tree that dominated the hollow. I focused the lens. It wasn't a shadow. It was Kane. He was kneeling, working by the glow of a tiny, shielded headlamp that cast a weak ring of light on the dark ground. He was digging. Not with a shovel, but with a small, specialized spade, moving the earth carefully, layer by layer. He wasn't looking for a water line or a fire pit. He was looking for something buried. The suspense began to build with terrifying speed. I was watching a man unearth 25 years of secrets. After maybe 20 minutes of painstaking work, he stopped. He reached into the shallow hole and pulled something out. It was a metal box, dark with rust and dirt, the size of a large tackle box. He didn't open it. He simply cradled it, brushing the dirt off its surface with a profound reverence. This was it, the money. The millions. He stood up, looking around the hollow one last time. He seemed satisfied. He put the box under his arm and began walking, not back to his tent, but straight toward the deeper, more rugged part of the Appalachian ridges. I had the proof. I knew he was still in possession of the stolen goods, and I knew the general area of his camp. I should have hiked back now and called it in. But the anger, the moral outrage, got the better of me. This man had spent his life living large on stolen money, hiding in the safety of my mountains, and now he was going to walk away with it. I saw his arrogance in his careful, unhurried steps. I made the fateful decision. I would follow him until he stopped again. I kept about 70 yards behind him, moving silently, using the darkness and the uneven terrain. He was walking with a renewed energy, fueled by his find. We flew almost 2 hours, climbing higher and higher until we reached a point where the trees began to thin out and the ground turned to sheer, slick rock face. He stopped at the entrance of a small, jagged cave I'd mapped years ago, a difficult-to-reach spot only known to a few rangers. He shined his tiny lamp into the mouth of the cave, then slipped inside. This was my chance. I was close enough now to see the entrance clearly. I sprinted toward the cave, not caring about the noise, and dropped to my belly just outside the entrance. I could hear the faint metallic clink as he placed the box down inside. "Old Ranger, I figured you'd follow me." The voice wasn't from inside the cave. It was from the woods directly behind me. My blood turned to ice water. He hadn't gone into the cave to hide. He had gone in to drop the box, then circled back around on a higher rocky path I hadn't seen. He'd been hunting me. The final high-tension scene was terrifyingly personal. I rolled instantly, scrambling to raise my rifle, but before I could get a sight picture, he spoke again. "Drop it. I'm not a kid, Ranger. I know you've got 5 bullets, and you know I only need 1. I looked up. He was standing on a boulder 5 feet above me, silhouetted against the dark sky, holding a short-barreled shotgun, a wicked, ugly thing designed for close-quarters fighting. He hadn't even broken a sweat. I lowered the rifle slowly, letting it drop to the earth. "Silas Kane," I said, my voice steady despite the hammer in my chest. "You should have stayed buried." "The money was buried," he chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "I was just waiting. You ruined my retirement, old man. You and your damn curiosity. Now you're gonna pay for it." He didn't shoot. He started talking, his voice calm, chillingly conversational. He told me exactly how he had planned the robbery, how they had lived off the land for years, slowly selling pieces of the gold they'd taken, waiting for the statute of limitations to expire on everything but the largest of the stolen assets. As he talked, he moved, slowly and deliberately, stepping down from the rock, circling me. He wasn't rushing the kill. He was savoring the moment, exerting his terrifying control. "Now the question," he said, stopping 5 feet in front of me, the shotgun pointed squarely at my chest. "Do I bury you with my partner's share, or do I make you look like a lost hunter who fell off the ridge?" I knew this was my only chance. My life, my justice, depended on a single moment. I didn't move my hands. I didn't reach for my knife. Instead, I simply said loudly, clearly, "Tracker, seek." Tracker, my old shepherd mix, wasn't locked in the cabin. I had let him out of the back door minutes after I'd left, knowing he'd trail me, and more importantly, trail the stranger's scent. A deep, ferocious growl erupted from the pitch-black woods to Kane's left. Tracker launched himself out of the darkness, not barking but snarling, a low, killing sound. He hit Kane hard, driving the man off balance. The shotgun went off with a massive, deafening boom, the blast harmlessly shredding the air above my head. I scrambled for my dropped rifle. Kane was screaming, struggling with the dog. I raised the rifle, found my sight, and fired 2 quick, controlled shots into the ground just beside him. The warning was clear. He stopped struggling, his grip on the shotgun loosening as Tracker's teeth clamped down on his arm. "It's over, Silas," I gasped, my arms shaking, pointing the rifle directly at his face. "You get up slow, drop the gun, and we walk down this mountain together." The look of cold hatred in his eyes was the last thing I saw before I called Tracker off. The revenge wasn't in the bullet. It was in the total dismantling of his decades of careful planning. He hadn't just met a retired ranger. He had met the one man in the mountain who remembered his face, and who had spent his life practicing the patience needed to bring him down. The silence of the mountain had been broken, but the justice had finally arrived.